We are told that architecture is the most permanent of all arts. A painting can be burned, a song can be forgotten, but a building is stone. It is meant to outlive the hands that carved it. We look at the pyramids, the Colosseum, the great cathedrals of Europe, and we see eternity. But in America, eternity is a concept that often gets in the way of the bottom line. There is a wound in the heart of New York City. If you go there today, to 33rd Street and 7th Avenue, you will find a squat, ugly office complex and a sports arena. Below ground, hundreds of thousands of commuters scurry like rats through low-ceilinged, fluorescent-lit tunnels that smell of stale air and misery. They keep their heads down, rushing to escape the maze. They do not know that they are walking through a graveyard. 60 years ago, on this exact spot, stood a palace. It was not a palace for kings or emperors or billionaires. It was a palace for the people. It was a structure so vast, so beautiful, and so ambitious that it rivaled the greatest wonders of ancient Rome. It was built of pink granite and travertine marble, a gateway to the continent that told every single person who entered it, "You matter. You are a citizen of a great nation." This was Pennsylvania Station, and in 1963, in broad daylight, we murdered it. We didn't just tear it down, we desecrated it. We took the eagles that guarded the entrances and threw them into swamps. We took the glorious columns and crushed them into gravel. We committed what the New York Times would later call a monumental act of vandalism. But the true tragedy of Penn Station isn't just that we lost a beautiful building. The true dark story is why we destroyed it. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a war. It was a cold, calculated decision made by men who looked at a masterpiece and saw only real estate. This is the story of America's greatest architectural crime, a story of a visionary who died to build a dream and a corporation that sold that dream for scrap metal. This is the dark story of the rise and fall of Pennsylvania Station. To understand the death of the station, we must first understand the miracle of its birth, and it begins with one man, Alexander Cassatt. In 1899, Alexander Cassatt became the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the PRR. At the time, the PRR was not just a company, it was a superpower. It was the standard railroad of the world, a corporation with a budget larger than the U.S. government, controlling thousands of miles of track that served as the arteries of American industry. They owned the steel mills, they owned the coal mines, and they owned the politicians. But they had one humiliating weakness, one fatal flaw that drove them mad. They could not get into New York City. The Hudson River was a fortress. It was a mile-wide moat protecting the island of Manhattan from the rest of the continent. For decades, the mighty trains of the Pennsylvania Railroad would roar across the country, from Chicago, from St. Louis, from Philadelphia, only to screech to a halt at the water's edge in New Jersey. It was a daily humiliation. If you were a titan of industry or a simple immigrant traveling to the greatest city in America, your journey ended in the mud of New Jersey. You had to get off the train, drag your luggage through the cold, board a crowded, slow-moving ferry, and float across the river to New York. It was inefficient, it was unglamorous, and for a man like Alexander Cassatt, it was unacceptable. Cassatt was an aristocrat, the brother of the famous Impressionist painter Mary Cassatt. He was a man of taste and culture, but he was also an engineer. He looked at the Hudson River and he didn't see nature, he saw an enemy line that needed to be breached. Other railroad barons had tried to bridge the river and failed. The state borders, the massive span, and the competing interests made a bridge impossible. So Cassatt decided to do the impossible. If he couldn't go over the river, he would go under it. Today, we take tunnels for granted, but in 1900, the idea of tunneling under the Hudson River was considered suicide. The river bottom wasn't solid rock, it was silt, a thick, gelatinous mud that had the consistency of toothpaste. Engineers warned that any tunnel would simply float or crack under the weight of the water and the shifting mud. It was a graveyard for ambition. A previous attempt in the 1870s had ended in disaster and death. But Cassatt was possessed. He traveled to Paris to see the new electric trains at the Gare d'Orsay. He realized that the age of steam was ending. Steam locomotives in a long tunnel would suffocate the passengers with smoke, but electricity changed the physics. Electric trains ran clean. They could dive deep underground, run silent and fast, and emerge in the center of the city without choking the riders. Cassatt returned to America with a plan that terrified his board of directors. He didn't just want a tunnel, he wanted a complete system. He proposed 2 single-track tunnels under the Hudson River from New Jersey, 4 tunnels under the East River to Long Island, and a bridge to New England. And in the center of it all, carved out of the bedrock of the Manhattan Tenderloin District, the most notorious slum in the city, would be the greatest train station ever built. The cost was astronomical. In today's money, it was a multi-billion-dollar investment entirely privately funded. If it failed, it would bankrupt the most powerful company in the world. It was a gamble on the future of New York. The construction began in 1904, and it was a war. For years, the city heard the constant thrum of dynamite. The sandhogs, the brave men who dug the tunnels, worked in pressurized airlocks deep beneath the river. The pressure was so intense that if they came up too fast, their blood would boil with the bends, crippling or killing them. It was a brutal, terrifying environment. They were fighting the river, inch by inch, bolting together massive rings of cast iron to hold back the crushing weight of the Hudson. On the surface, Cassatt had another battle. He had to clear the land. The site chosen for the station was the Tenderloin, a district of brothels, gambling dens, and overcrowded tenements. The Pennsylvania Railroad bought up property secretly, block by block, displacing thousands of residents. It was the first act of destruction in the station's history, destroying a neighborhood to build a monument. As the tunnels inched toward Manhattan from New Jersey and Long Island, Alexander Cassatt's health began to fail. The stress of the project, the political battles, and the sheer weight of the responsibility were killing him. He worked himself into the ground, obsessing over every detail, from the tunnel engineering to the color of the stone. He died in 1906. He died of heart failure in his office, working on the plans for his great station. He never saw a single train enter the tunnels. He never saw the sunlight hit the columns of the waiting room. He was the Moses of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He led them to the promised land, but was not allowed to enter it. With Cassatt gone, the task of finishing the station fell to the architects, McKim, Meade, and White. Charles McKim, the lead architect, understood Cassatt's vision perfectly. He knew this couldn't just be a train shed, it had to be a civic monument. McKim looked to the past for inspiration. He didn't look at other train stations, he looked at the baths of Caracalla in Rome. The Roman baths were public spaces where citizens of all classes mingled, surrounded by immense beauty. McKim wanted to recreate that democratic grandeur in New York. He designed a building that was colossal. It covered 2 full city blocks from 31st to 33rd Streets and from 7th to 8th Avenue. The exterior was a colonnade of pink granite columns, severe and majestic. It didn't have a skyscraper on top of it to make money. It didn't have billboards. It was a temple. But the real magic was inside. When you walked through the entrance, you didn't enter a dark hallway. You entered an arcade lined with shops, modeled after the markets of Trajan. And then you stepped into the main waiting room. This room was the largest indoor space in New York City. The ceiling soared 150 feet into the air, higher than the nave of St. Peter's Basilica. It was clad in travertine marble, a stone that McKim insisted on importing from Italy because it had a warmth and texture that felt like human skin. The room was illuminated by massive thermal windows that captured the shifting light of the sky. It was a space that demanded silence. People who entered it instinctively lowered their voices. It wasn't just a place to wait for a train. It was a place to feel the weight of history. It made the farmer from Ohio and the banker from Wall Street feel equal. They were both small beneath those soaring vaults. Beyond the waiting room was the concourse. This was the transition from the stone of Rome to the steel of the industrial age. Here, the roof was a web of glass and iron, inspired by the train sheds of Paris and London. If you had walked into Pennsylvania Station in 1945, you would have seen the empire at its zenith. It was the busiest train station in history. More than 100 million passengers a year flowed through its granite arteries. It was the beating heart of the American war effort, pumping soldiers to the front lines and bringing them home to a victorious nation. The station was alive. It vibrated with the energy of a country that had just conquered the world. But looking back, we can see what they couldn't. The rot had already started. The tragedy of Pennsylvania Station is that it was dying even while it was most alive. The seeds of its destruction were sown not in the station itself, but in the factories of Detroit and the runways of frantic new airports. While the Pennsylvania Railroad was busy moving troops, the American government was busy planning its execution. They didn't call it an execution, they called it the future. In the 1950s, a new god emerged in America, the car. The United States government, flush with post-war cash, poured billions of dollars into the interstate highway system. They subsidized airports, built roads, and encouraged the suburban sprawl that demanded automobiles. But they did not subsidize the railroads. In fact, they taxed them. The Pennsylvania Railroad, once the standard of the world, found itself in a rigged fight. They had to pay property taxes on every mile of track, every bridge, and every station they owned. Meanwhile, the trucking companies drove for free on roads built by the taxpayers, and airlines landed at airports built by the cities. It was economic strangulation. The palace for the people began to suffer. The Pennsylvania Railroad started bleeding money. In 1946, they reported their first loss in history. Panic set in. The executives in Philadelphia looked at their balance sheets and saw red ink everywhere. They needed to cut costs, and they needed to do it fast. The first casualty was the light. During World War II, the magnificent glass roof of the concourse, the crystal palace that McKim had designed to let the heavens in, had been painted black. It was a precaution against potential German air raids. But when the war ended, the railroad didn't have the money to clean the glass. So the black paint stayed. For nearly 2 decades, the glorious sun-drenched concourse was plunged into a permanent gloomy twilight. The Cathedral of Light became a cave. The maintenance stopped. The pink granite, once glowing and warm, turned a sullen gray from decades of coal soot and city exhaust. The restrooms became dirty. The homeless began to sleep in the grand corridors where presidents had once walked. The station, which was designed to uplift the human spirit, began to depress it. The public perception shifted. In 1910, Penn Station was a wonder. By 1955, it was seen as a dinosaur. It was a drafty, echoing relic of a bygone era. Modern America wanted low ceilings, air conditioning, and plastic. They didn't want Roman baths, they wanted efficiency. The grandeur of the past wasn't seen as heritage, it was seen as waste. By the late 1950s, the Pennsylvania Railroad was desperate. They were sitting on a piece of real estate in the center of Manhattan that was worth a fortune, yet the building sitting on top of it was costing them millions to maintain. It was here that the concept of air rights entered the story, the weapon that would kill the station. Real estate developers approached the railroad with a seductive offer. They didn't care about the station. They didn't care about the columns or the eagles. They cared about the air above the tracks. They proposed a deal: demolish the station, move the tracks underground, and build a massive sports arena and office tower on top. For the railroad executives, it seemed like a lifeline. They could get a brand new, modern, smaller station for free, stop paying for the maintenance of the giant palace, and make millions in rent from the new buildings. It was a purely financial decision. They looked at a spreadsheet, and the numbers told them that Penn Station was worth more dead than alive. The deal was made in secret. The railroad paired with the Graham and Page Corporation, which owned Madison Square Garden. They planned to demolish the Roman temple and replace it with a concrete drum. When the news finally broke in the New York Times in 1961, the reaction was silence. This is the hardest part of the story to understand today. We assume there must have been riots. We assume people chained themselves to the columns. But in 1961, the architectural preservation movement did not exist. There were no laws protecting landmarks. In fact, the very idea of landmark preservation was alien to the American mindset of the time. New was always better than old. The general public, tired of the dirty, gloomy station, mostly shrugged. Good riddance, some said. It's a dusty old barn. The railroad's propaganda machine worked overtime, promising a space-age station with air conditioning and fluorescent lights. They sold the destruction as an upgrade. Only a small group of architects and writers saw what was coming. They realized that New York was about to lobotomize itself. A group of young architects, led by Norval White and Elliot Wilensky, formed Agbani, Action Group for Better Architecture in New York. They were the first resistance. They weren't fighting for money, they were fighting for the soul of the city. They wrote letters, they held picket signs, they desperately tried to explain to the public that a city without its past is like a man without a memory. They reached out to the mayor, Robert F. Wagner. They reached out to the newspapers. They screamed from the rooftops that this was a crime against culture. Famous architect Philip Johnson wrote a letter saying, "We will be judged by what we destroy." But they were too few, and they were too late. The City Planning Commission was more interested in tax revenue and modernization than in Roman columns. The fix was in. The railroad needed the money, the developers wanted the profits, and the politicians wanted the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new sports arena. In 1963, the final approval was given. The death warrant was signed. The finest building in America, a structure built to stand for 1,000 years, had only lasted for 53. The architects who had fought so hard were crushed. They had failed. But in their failure, they sparked something new. They realized too late that you don't know what you have until it's gone. The tragedy of Penn Station would become the martyr moment for the entire world of preservation, but that realization would come at a terrible price. On the evening of October 27, 1963, a rainy, miserable night, a few stragglers walked through the great waiting room for the last time. The shops were closing, the lights were dim, the station felt like a terminally ill patient waiting for the end. There was no ceremony, there was no funeral. The railroad didn't want to draw attention to what they were doing, they just wanted it gone. They viewed the station as debris that hadn't been cleared yet. The next morning, the jackhammers would arrive, and the sound of them tearing into the stone would echo like gunshots through the heart of New York City. The unforgivable demolition was about to begin. The demolition began on the morning of October 28, 1963. It wasn't a quick death. You cannot easily kill a building that was designed to last for eternity. The Pennsylvania Railroad had built the station using the same engineering principles as the aqueducts of Rome. The walls were thick pink granite. The steel columns were massive. The concrete was reinforced with a density that broke the jackhammers. The demolition crews were shocked. They expected the building to crumble like a modern office block. Instead, the station fought back. It took 3 years to tear it down. 3 years of constant noise, constant dust, and constant violence. It was a slow-motion murder. To destroy the main waiting room, they couldn't just knock it over. They had to peel it apart, layer by layer. The first thing to go was the roof. They stripped away the glass and the copper, exposing the great travertine interior to the rain and the snow for the first time in 50 years. For a brief, haunting period, Penn Station became an accidental masterpiece of surrealism. It looked like a Roman forum dropped into the middle of mid-century Manhattan. Sunlight, unfiltered by dirty glass, finally poured into the space, but it only served to illuminate the destruction. Commuters still had to use the station while it was being destroyed above their heads. This was the ultimate indignity. To get to their trains, passengers had to navigate makeshift plywood tunnels, dodging dripping water and falling dust. They could hear the jackhammers screaming just a few feet away. They were walking through the carcass of the building while it was being devoured. The architects of the destruction showed no mercy. They didn't carefully dismantle the artwork. They smashed it. The beautiful relief sculptures, the ornate clocks, the brass railings, all of it was treated as trash. The workers were just doing a job. They didn't see art, they saw tonnage. The most painful symbol of this destruction was the eagles. Adolf Weinman, a master sculptor, had carved 22 massive granite eagles to guard the cornice of the station. They were symbols of American strength and freedom. They had watched over the city for half a century. When the cranes came for them, they didn't lower them gently. They wrapped chains around their necks and yanked them from their perches. Photos from that day show the eagles dangling in the air, looking like hanged men. Some were saved, rescued by museums or universities at the last minute, but many were simply discarded. They were treated as excess weight. The sight of these majestic birds, grounded and bound in chains, became the rallying cry for a generation of preservationists. It was a visual metaphor for what America was doing to its own culture, chained, dragged down, and sold for scrap. Where did the palace go? It went to the swamp. Most of the pink granite, the travertine, and the columns were trucked across the river to the Secaucus Meadows in New Jersey, ironically back to the very state the tunnels were built to escape. There, in the mud and the reeds, the pieces of the station were dumped like common garbage. It created a scene that looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Massive classical columns lying sideways in the marsh, heads of stone gods half buried in the dirt. It was the Alice in Wonderland phase of the demolition. If you drove past the swamp in 1964, you would see the ruins of Rome rotting in New Jersey. It was a stark physical representation of the value we placed on our history. We didn't even recycle it. We just threw it away. Inside the station, the destruction was even more intimate. The walls of the waiting room were lined with travertine, a stone that is actually formed by mineral springs. It is porous and feels alive. When the wrecking balls hit the travertine, it didn't just break, it shattered into dust. A fine white powder coated everything in the vicinity. The workers wore masks, looking like ghosts moving through a fog. The warmth that Cassatt and McKim had prized so highly was pulverized into a choking cloud. One observer noted that the station seemed to bleed dust. Every blow of the hammer released 50 years of memories. The sounds of footsteps, the whispers of lovers, the announcements of departures, all trapped in the stone, now released into the uncaring air of 1964. As the old station came down, the new monster began to rise. The new Madison Square Garden was a circular arena. To support its weight, they had to drive heavy steel piles down through the floor of the old station. This was the final insult. They pierced the heart of the old masterpiece to build the foundation of the new one. The tracks below remained, but the sky was stolen. A heavy concrete slab was poured over the tracks, sealing the commuters into permanent darkness. The Cathedral of Light was officially capped. The tomb was sealed. By 1966, the last column had fallen. The last eagle was gone. The site where Alexander Cassatt had dreamed of a gateway to the continent was now just a construction site for a hockey arena and a bowling alley. The transformation was complete. America had successfully traded a palace for a pizza stand. When the dust finally settled, there was a strange feeling in New York, a hangover. People started to realize what they had lost. The newspapers, which had been so quiet during the planning phase, now wrote eulogies. The New York Times published an editorial that would become famous. Any city gets what it admires, will pay for, and ultimately deserves. We want and deserve tin can architecture in a tin horn culture. And we will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. It was a bitter epitaph, but the death of Penn Station wasn't just an ending. In a strange twist of fate, the sheer brutality of its destruction would spark a revolution. The station had to die so that other buildings could live. The ghost of Penn Station was about to become the most powerful force in American architecture.
There is a specific kind of silence that follows a crime. By 1965, the jackhammers had stopped. The dust had settled on 7th Avenue. The last eagle had been carted away to the swamp, and New York City woke up with a hangover. For 3 years, the city had watched the slow execution of its greatest building with a strange mixture of apathy and denial. But once the building was actually gone, Once the sky was empty where the great cornice used to be, the reality hit. People began to emerge from the subway, looking up, expecting to see the pink granite columns, only to find themselves staring at the cheap steel skeleton of a sports arena. A collective feeling of nausea swept through the cultural elite of the city. They realized, with a sinking feeling in their stomachs, that they had let something irreplaceable slip through their fingers. They had traded a masterpiece for a mistake. The demolition of Penn Station was no longer just a construction project, it was a trauma. It was the moment America lost its innocence about progress. For the first time, we realized that new did not always mean better. Sometimes new just meant cheaper. In the history of every great movement, there is a martyr, a victim whose death is so unjust, so brutal, that it forces the world to change. Pennsylvania Station was that martyr. Its destruction radicalized the people of New York. The architects who had failed to save the station, men like Norval White and Elliot Wilensky, didn't give up. They got angry. They realized that relying on the goodwill of corporations was a suicide pact. Corporations had no soul. They had shareholders. If you wanted to save history, you couldn't ask nicely. You needed a weapon. You needed a law. The rubble of Penn Station was still being cleared when the pressure on Mayor Robert F. Wagner became unbearable. The citizens demanded a guarantee. They said, "Never again." They demanded that the government step in and strip property owners of the right to destroy their own buildings if those buildings were part of the city's soul. It was a radical idea in capitalist America. It challenged the very core of property rights. But the ghost of Penn Station was too loud to ignore. In April 1965, Mayor Wagner signed the Landmarks Preservation Law. It was the first law of its kind in a major American city. It created the Landmarks Preservation Commission, a government body with the power to say no. It gave the city the authority to designate a building as a landmark, making it illegal to alter or destroy it without permission. It was a shield forged from the scrap metal of Penn Station. The law was written in legal jargon, but its spirit was pure poetry. It declared that these buildings had a special historical or aesthetic interest or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the city, state, or nation. It was an admission that a city is more than just real estate. A city is a memory. But laws are just paper until they are tested, and the test was coming sooner than anyone expected, because the developers, emboldened by their victory at Penn Station, had already picked their next target, and this time they aimed even higher. Hardly had the ink dried on the Landmarks Law when the Penn Central Railroad, the same company that had destroyed Penn Station, announced a new plan. They were running out of money again, and they looked across town at their other masterpiece, Grand Central Terminal. Grand Central was the sister of Penn Station. It was the Beaux-Arts beauty of the East Side. It had the starry ceiling, the great clock, the vast windows. And the railroad executives looked at it and saw the same thing they saw at Penn Station, a waste of space. They hired the famous modernist architect Marcel Breuer to design a massive office tower that would sit on top of Grand Central. To build it, they would have to destroy the facade and mutilate the main waiting room. They argued, "It's our property. We can do what we want, just like we did at Penn Station." But this time, things were different. This time, the ghosts were watching. The fight to save Grand Central became the first great battle of the new preservation movement. And unlike the lonely architects who fought for Penn Station, this movement had a general with star power, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. The former First Lady was a New Yorker. She remembered Penn Station. She remembered the pain of seeing it destroyed. When she heard they were coming for Grand Central, she stepped into the spotlight. She didn't just lend her name, she led the charge. She famously said, "Is it not cruel to let our city die by degrees, stripped of all her proud monuments, until there will be nothing left of all her history and beauty to inspire our children?" Her words were electric. They galvanized the public. Suddenly, saving old buildings wasn't just for history professors, it was glamorous. It was a moral crusade. The Penn Station effect had turned the tide. The railroads sued the city. They argued that the landmarks law was unconstitutional, that it was taking their property value without compensation. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. It was the ultimate showdown, corporate profit versus public memory. In 1978, the Supreme Court delivered their verdict. In a decision that shocked the business world, they ruled in favor of the city. They ruled that a city does have the right to protect its soul. They validated the landmarks law. Grand Central was saved. But let us be clear, Grand Central was not saved by the Supreme Court. It was not saved by Jacqueline Kennedy. It was saved by the sacrifice of Penn Station. Penn Station took the bullet so that Grand Central could live. It was the blood sacrifice that awakened the conscience of the nation. The victory at Grand Central was sweet, but it was bitter too. Every time a New Yorker walked through the glorious sunlit concourse of Grand Central, they couldn't help but think of the dark, rat-maze tunnels on the other side of town. We had a law now, we had a commission, we had landmarks, but we didn't have it. We didn't have the pink granite. We didn't have the light. The guilt of 1963 never went away. It festered. As the 1970s turned into the 80s and 90s, the new Penn Station, the underground dungeon, became a symbol of everything wrong with modern New York. It was dirty, unsafe, confusing, and ugly. It became the most hated public space in America. And slowly, a new idea began to form. A whisper that started as a fantasy and grew into an obsession. If we could save Grand Central, could we possibly fix Penn Station? Could we undo the crime? For decades, millions of people suffered in that basement. The art historian Vincent Scully famously described the difference between the two eras. One entered the city like a god, one scuttles in now like a rat. That quote became the motto of the station. We were a nation of rats, scuttling through the sewers of our own making. But across the street from the monstrosity of Madison Square Garden sat another building, a building that everyone had forgotten, the James A. Farley Post Office. It was built by the same architects, McKim, Mead, and White. It was built in the same year, 1910. It had the same pink granite. It had the same Corinthian columns. It was the twin brother of the murdered station. And it was sitting there, empty, waiting for a second chance.
Across 8th Avenue, staring directly at the crime scene, stood a ghost. Most people walked past the James A. Farley Post Office without noticing it. They didn't realize that it wasn't just a post office, it was a mirror. It was designed by the same architects, McKim, Mead, and White. It was built in the same year, 1910. It was wrapped in the same pink granite.
It even had the same Corinthian columns. It was the twin brother of Penn Station, and for 30 years it stood there, silent and empty, watching its brother's killer, Madison Square Garden, thrive across the street. While the commuters suffered in the rat maze below ground, the post office sat largely abandoned. As email replaced letters, the vast sorting rooms of the Farley Building fell silent. It became a cavern of dust and echoes, a reminder of what New York used to look like. It was a sleeping giant waiting for someone to wake it up. Enter Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Moynihan was a United States senator, but before that, he was a poor kid in Hell's Kitchen. As a boy, he had shined shoes in the old Penn Station. He had felt the warmth of the travertine. He had seen the light stream through the windows. He never forgave the city for destroying it. In the early 1990s, Moynihan looked at the empty post office and had a radical idea. He said, "The station is gone, but the spirit is still here." His plan was simple but ambitious. Take the empty post office, gut the inside, and turn it into a new train hall. It wouldn't bring back the original station, nothing could do that, but it would give New York back its dignity. It would be an act of penance, a way to say, "I'm sorry," to history. He campaigned for it with the fervor of a preacher. He famously said, "Architecture is inescapable. It affects the human spirit." He wanted to prove that America could still build great things. But this is America, and in America, a good idea is nothing without funding. For 20 years, the Moynihan Station project sat in purgatory. Politicians made speeches, governors cut ribbons for groundbreakings that never happened. The project became a joke in New York real estate circles. It was the Phantom Station. Every few years, a new design would be released, and then the funding would dry up. Or a recession would hit, or 9/11 would shift the priorities of the nation. Senator Moynihan died in 2003, his dream unfulfilled. It seemed like the curse of Penn Station was extending to its twin. The dark story wasn't over, it was just becoming a story of incompetence. Meanwhile, the situation underground was getting worse. The rat maze was now handling 600,000 people a day, 3 times what it was designed for. It was hot, crowded, and dangerous. It became a symbol of American infrastructure failure. Then came 2017, the summer of hell. The aging tracks beneath the station began to fail. Derailments became common. Commuters were stranded for hours in dark tunnels. The anger in the city reached a boiling point. New York could no longer ignore the wound. The economic engine of the city was choking on its own lack of vision. The governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, finally realized that this wasn't just about aesthetics anymore. It was about survival. He pushed the Moynihan Train Hall project from a maybe to a must. He declared that the transformation of the Farley Post Office would happen, and it would happen now. The money was found. The contracts were signed. The sleeping giant across the street was finally going to wake up. When the construction crews entered the Farley Building, they found a treasure. Buried beneath layers of plaster and dropped ceilings was a massive steel skeleton. The trusses that held up the roof were the same design as the ones in the original Penn Station. They were the DNA of the lost masterpiece. The architects decided not to hide the steel. They stripped it bare. They wanted to show the bones of the building. They wanted the new station to be a conversation between the past and the future. The plan was to cut a massive skylight into the roof, recreating the cathedral of light that had been painted black and destroyed in the old station. It was a poetic reversal. Where the old station had its light stolen, the new one would have its light restored. The cost was staggering, $1.6 billion. Critics argued it was too much. They said it was just a fancy waiting room because the tracks remained underground, and they were right, it was a waiting room, but they missed the point. Penn Station had never been just about waiting, it was about arriving. It was about how a democracy treats its citizens. As the glass skylight was lowered into place in 2020, the city held its breath. For the first time in 53 years, since the Eagles were thrown into the swamp, New York was about to have a grand entrance again. The ghost of Alexander Cassatt and the ghost of Senator Moynihan were finally getting their answer. But would it be enough? Could a new building ever truly replace the old one, or are we just putting a bandage on an amputation?
On January 1, 2021, the doors of the Moynihan Train Hall swung open. It was a strange moment in history. The world was in the grip of a pandemic. The city was quieter than it had been in a century. But inside the hall, the silence wasn't sad, it was reverent. For the first time in 57 years, a traveler could arrive in New York City and see the sky. The new hall is a triumph. It is vast. It is clad in Tennessee Quaker gray marble. The giant steel trusses, the original bones from 1910, are exposed, painted a deep industrial black. They arch over the commuters like the ribs of a leviathan, holding up a frantic, beautiful web of glass. When you walk in, you feel a sudden shift in your chest. The claustrophobia of the rat maze vanishes. You stand taller. You walk slower. It does exactly what Alexander Cassatt wanted his station to do. It makes you feel important. It restores the dignity of the arrival. But as beautiful as it is, we must tell the truth. It is not Penn Station. The original Penn Station was a Roman temple. It was heavy, solid, and timeless. It smelled of stone and old money. The new Moynihan Hall is a modern airport terminal dressed in historical clothing. It is sleek, airy, and corporate. It is an echo, not the voice itself. And that is the bittersweet reality of this story. We can fix the infrastructure. We can build new roofs. We can spend $1.6 billion to apologize to the past. But we can never truly bring back what we destroyed. The pink granite is gone. The silence of the great waiting room is gone. The specific feeling of standing in a space that was built for eternity, that is gone. Moynihan Hall is a bandage, a beautiful, expensive, necessary bandage, but underneath the scar remains. The tracks are still buried deep below, far from the light. The original site of the palace is still crushed beneath the weight of Madison Square Garden. We have healed the wound, but the limb is still missing. So, was the death of Pennsylvania Station in vain? No. And this is the most important part of the dark story. The destruction of Penn Station was a crime, yes, but it was also a sacrifice. If Penn Station had not died, Grand Central Terminal would likely be an office tower today. The chaotic, destructive energy of the 1960s would have eaten New York alive if Penn Station hadn't choked it. The shock of losing this building gave birth to the Landmarks Preservation Commission. It created the legal framework that saves thousands of historic buildings across America every single year. Every time you walk past a preserved brownstone in Brooklyn, or a historic theater in Los Angeles, or a saved courthouse in Chicago, you are looking at the legacy of Penn Station. It died so that they could live. It was the martyr that taught America the value of its own soul. But the lesson is not finished. We live in an age that is just as dangerous as the 1960s. We are obsessed with efficiency. We are obsessed with digital spaces, not physical ones. We are constantly told that old means obsolete. The story of Penn Station is a warning. It warns us that once you destroy a monument, you destroy the memory attached to it. You cannot 3D print history. You cannot download heritage. Once the stone is crushed, it is just gravel. We must look at our cities today, at the libraries, the post offices, the schools, and ask ourselves, what are we allowing to rot? What are we planning to tear down? And 50 years from now, will our grandchildren look at photos of our world and ask, why did you let that happen? Today, if you take the train out of New York, try to leave from the Moynihan Hall. Look up at the glass, appreciate the light. But before you board your train, walk across the street. Go to the corner of 7th Avenue and 33rd Street. Stand in the shadow of the ugly arena. Close your eyes and listen. If you listen closely enough, beneath the roar of the taxis and the noise of the city, you might just hear the faint echo of a jackhammer. You might hear the cry of a stone eagle falling from the sky. Remember that sound, because that is the sound of a civilization forgetting who it is. Penn Station is dead. Long live the station.